Every Sunday, Unitarian Universalists across the country and around the world light a chalice as a symbol of our faith. If you happen to have a chalice at home or perhaps a candle, I invite you to grab that now and light your chalice as you follow along and perhaps read at home to the chalice lighting. Universal mystery, guide us away from the desire to shine, light in all corners. Teach us to embrace the night, for without the darkness, we never see the stars. Now, if you'll join us in our opening hymn, Faith is a Forest.
Doubts play and hide. Insight can hear the still small voice deep inside. Web of life, may this thread I weave, strength and commitment to all I believe. Vision be my guide as I seek my way. Lead me into this tender day. Speak through me in all I do and say. Seeds of both meek and strong are scattered in air. Dignity shines undimmed by bigotry's glare. Web of life, may this thread I weave help me bear witness to all I believe. Justice be my guide as I seek my way. Lead me into this tender day. Speak through me in all I do and say. Fortune and famine ride the swift winds of chance. Sorrow and pleasure seem united in dance. Web of life, may this thread I weave mingle compassion with all I believe. Mercy be my guide as I seek my way. Lead me into this tender day. Speak through me in all I do and say.
A popular myth in southern China in the 3rd to the 6th century of the Common Era was that of Pan Ku. Predominantly, it is a cosmic egg ex nihilo myth. I'll mention the different categories of these myths later, but for now, we'll simply concentrate on the story to get a feel for this genre. At first, there was nothing. Time passed and nothing became something. Time passed and something split in two. The two were male and female. The two produced two more, and these two produced Pan Ku, the first being, the great man, the creator. First, there was a great cosmic egg. Inside the egg was chaos, and floating in chaos was Pan Ku, the undeveloped, the divine embryo. And Pan Ku burst out of the egg, 4 times larger than any man today, with a hammer and chisel in his hand, with which he fashioned the world. 2 great horns grew out of his head. 2 long tusks grew from his upper jaw, and he was covered with hair. A note here, in China, the horned head is always the symbol of supernatural power. Also, Pan Ku developed within this chaos of the cosmic egg and spent a very long time there, said to be an incubation period of 18,000 years. And then he broke the egg and emerged as a supernatural entity. So to this point, this is a cosmic egg myth. But the story goes on. Panku went to work at once, mightily, to put the world in order. He chiseled the land and the sky apart. He piled up the mountains on the earth and dug the valleys deep and made courses for the rivers. High above ride the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky. Where Panku placed them, below roll the four seas. He taught mankind to build boats and showed him how to throw bridges over rivers. And he told them the secrets of the precious stones. Note here that Panku was working with true supernatural effort and skill to achieve all of these things. He had to work to keep all the developing elements apart, especially the earth and the heavens. He had to brace his feet against the earth and his shoulders against the heavens. This eventually wore him down. And after he perceived that his work was done, he was exhausted and lay down to rest and immediately died. But the story continues. However, the world was not finished when Panku died. Only his death could perfect the universe. From his skull was shaped the dome of the sky, and from his flesh was formed the soil of the fields. From his bones came the rocks. From his blood, the rivers and seas. From his hair came all vegetation. His breath was the wind. His voice made thunder. His right eye became the moon. His left eye, the sun. From his saliva or sweat came rain. And from the vermin which covered his body came forth mankind. When Panku wept, his tears became the yellow river. And when he died, his body formed the 5 sacred mountains of China. It is said that Panku's image can still be seen in a cave cherished by the Miao tribe in the mountains of Guangxi, and that along with the image of Panku stand also images of the 3 great sovereigns who followed him, the Lord of heaven, the Lord of earth, and the Lord of man. Now, while this story of Panku begins as an example of a cosmic egg, ex nihilo genre, it ends up as a mixed creation myth. Panku is originated out of a very primordial, chaotic environment after many years of incubation in an egg. But after he breaks out of the egg, all kinds of things start to happen. And after he dies of exhaustion from his physical efforts, creation then proceeds through a different model. This is the dismembered creature type of creation myth. Elements of Panku's body are transformed into things needed to create or complete creation. The story of Panku attempts to explain the dualistic nature of most of observable reality. Duality succeeds a primal chaos, thus indicating that creation might be a continuing process.
Giving out of what is our own is a transformative act. As a community of faith, we collect an offering not for ourselves or our congregation, but to give to others as a collective action of our community and as a way to live out our shared values. Please give with a generous heart to support the July Share the Plate recipients, the Women's Home. The Women's Home provides housing assistance, residential treatment, and collaborative community services to prepare women and their families to become empowered and productive forces in their communities. And as always, 25% of your offering will go to Interfaith Ministries Meals on Wheels, feeding Houston seniors. We have 3 ways to give. You can text the number on the screen, go to our webpage for online giving, or if you prefer to mail a check, we are still checking the mail at the church. The link for the online giving portal will be in the chat. Thank you for sharing as you were able.
At this point in the service, please find a place to be comfortable, to be relaxed, and to feel grounded, connected to our congregation, our friends, and our neighbors. Let us also connect ourselves to the greater natural world, which has always nourished and sustained us. Reflect on the views of our ancestors as they struggled to understand their surroundings. Think about what they thought and questioned, and how that relates to our continuing questions of life. Relax, breathe easily as we enter into meditation and silence. Amen, and blessed be. A church has many different faces. It can focus on traditional religious topics such as scripture, theology, doctrine, and religious history. At other times, basic moral and ethical considerations are addressed, sometimes separately from any specific religious tradition. More and more often, particularly at Emerson, social action and justice topics are discussed, both in religious education classes and in the worship services. In selecting a topic for this morning's worship, I decided to take a general look at world religion, not at topics that might be time or location specific. And in that regard, people have always asked the same very basic questions. Who am I? Where did I come from? What is this place I inhabit? Is there something beyond this? And how should I live my life? One way in which many religions have tried to answer those questions is through the use of myths, particularly creation myths. This attempt to find truth through myth is something that differentiates religion from philosophy and science, both of which also attempt to answer these same questions. Creation myths have apparently been part of human culture even in prehistoric times. Some would prefer to call them stories rather than myths because of a modern conception that myth denotes falsehood. They may believe that specific creation stories are definitely true, a product of divine revelation. But whatever one's opinion might be about these fantastic tales of creation, they are intensely interesting. Far beyond any claim for historical accuracy, they tell us a great deal about ancient humanity, the way it thought, the way it tried to explain its surroundings. The stories are also fun. They allow lighter moments, free of deeper philosophical and religious connotations that sometimes have engendered controversy and unease. So what are we talking about when we call something a myth? Elizabeth Vandiver, professor of classics at Whitman College, has listed 5 major characteristics of myths, and I'll share those with you. First, myths are traditional tales or stories. They're presented in narrative form. They're usually handed down in a society from one generation to the next. Thus, an individual does not simply generate a myth one day. Myths are instead established societal and cultural tales. Secondly, myths are set in the past, usually the very distant past, and they reflect the assumption that in that distant past, things were quite different in many ways. Third, myths are felt to be ostensibly true in some sense. And within specific cultures, myths are judged to be true accounts of the way things actually were. Fourth, myths often explain, justify, instruct, or warn. So they do have clear functions. And finally, myths frequently concern gods, the supernatural, or even more abstract situations. But there's one more important point to emphasize about myths. A myth can only be a myth if you don't believe it. That means that you don't believe it factually. You might believe that it contains some truth in the form of meaning, rather than being narratively correct. But on the other hand, you might indeed believe that it is completely true as a divine truth, and the story would thus lose its connotation as a myth. So one person's myth is another's divine truth. And we see this position frequently taken in the West, especially regarding the creation stories of the Hebrew Bible. But the Navajo, for example, believe just as strongly that their emergence creation myth is true. And I will share this with you later. Creation myths do have a few general patterns to them. They begin at a specified point and in a specified environment. The specified point usually involves some type of supernatural element that is usually a god, but also lesser and possibly even more abstract elements. This brings up a question of where did those supernatural elements come from? Who created them? And some of the creation myths do try to include that question in the discussion. The specified environment is usually complicated, and it tends to be a key factor in separating out individual creation stories. Does creation proceed out of nothing? That's something called ex nihilo, or is there something already present that simply becomes ordered? And most creation stories actually fall into this latter variety, leaving open the question of where did that primordial substance come from? Nevertheless, after a creating or ordering event occurs, these stories are all characterized by increasing complexity. The created environments have many new features, some of which may not be completely compatible. Diversity has entered the picture, and it will be manifested in different characteristics such as dualism, good versus evil, male versus female, yin versus yang. And that dualism results in tension. The supernatural elements that have created this situation also change, at least in subsequent generations. the gods become more complex, more differentiated. And in the process, they develop what we would identify as human characteristics. And those characteristics or qualities include the worst of human nature. Gods are warlike. They're guilty of murder and incest, and they are frequently portrayed as lazy, vengeful, and incompetent. This vivid portrayal of creation, the subsequent events, and their controlling factors helped people who were trying to understand human experience. The negative aspects of human experience could be more easily understood if the overarching divine realm was somewhat corrupt. Now, some of this narrative thought was ultimately incorporated into religion, which then had the unenviable task of trying to craft it into a meaningful message for human society. Well, with these problems with myths, why do we still have them here in the 21st century? And we certainly do. They are ingrained in both Catholic and Protestant Christianity, as well as Judaism, and not to mention many of the Eastern and Native American religions. And this is a particularly pertinent question for Unitarian Universalists, since we have traditionally prided ourselves on our objective, intellectual, and philosophical approach to questions regarding religion and theology. But UUs also tout our commitment to the truth. And many of us believe that myths frequently contain meaningful truths about life and the cosmos. Maybe even more importantly, for UUs and others, myths stimulate our imaginations. They can allow us to experience freedom of thought that is not tied to rigid, logical, or other philosophical tenets. Myths are rich in imagery, something that has always been popular in religion. They're fun. They're often enjoyable stories about life, imparting the values of a society or a culture. People love stories. They love those as a means of relating information. And at Emerson, a very popular part of our worship services over the last several years have been a story for the ages, something that is often directed at youth, but really has deep meaning for adults. I'm going to mention a few characteristics of creation myths that I think are important and help us understand the various types that are out there. First, water is important. The ancients recognized water as a very basic substance, one that affected most aspects of their lives. Thus, it is understandable that water would be central to their visualization of the world and their place in it. Water was considered somewhat mysterious. It could be seen as dark or evil, particularly when it was depicted as the dark and salty depths. The darkness of the depths became ingrained in many creation stories. But water was also seen as being fresh and life-giving. And ironically, chaos and simplicity could both be associated with water. Creation was a process that advanced when one moved out of the water, resulting in new complexity, tension, and differentiation that humans could relate to the complexity they observed in their visible physical world. The ultimate differentiation was the creation of humanity, a progression characterized by a movement from the sea or water to dry land. And in some myths, though, that is not a steady progression. There could be a fall back to water, away from the differentiation, and a return to some degree of chaos. This is especially a feature of the flood myths in both the Mesopotamian Enuma Elish and in the Hebrew Bible. Catastrophic floods take us back to chaos and the undifferentiated state. But as the world then moves out again from the flood, there is recreation or a departure from the waters. A second general characteristic is that every creation myth is a cosmogony, and that literally means the beginning of order. Humans seem to have always abhorred chaos. We've sought order, structure, and explanations about life. And when supernatural elements or gods act upon chaos to establish order, there is a resultant partial explanation of why things are as they are. This expands our individual consciousness as well. In the process, myths become multivalent. That is, they seek to explain several different situations at once, greatly increasing their complexity. And they therefore become integrated into various religious beliefs and practices. Specific myths therefore often affirm a culture's values and their practices. They can establish an axis mundi, or world axis. Now, an axis mundi is where the natural and the divine worlds are believed to intersect. And this is therefore sacred. An axis mundi can be a physical location, it can be a church, it could be a sacred spot in nature, or it may be something as fluid as a creation story itself. This is clearly seen in some Eastern religions and in the religions of Native Americans. In this way, a myth is serving to provide working answers to questions regarding the world. And in the process, it also defines a culture or society and binds them together in community. And whether or not the myth is narratively or factually true is of secondary importance. Now, I've mentioned this before, but scholars have placed creation myths into various categories. Now, we don't have to understand those, but I do think that realizing what they are help us understand why some of them differ. Ex nihilo myths that I mentioned before are those in which a deity creates the cosmos via thought, word, dream, or some effluent such as seed or tears. This is creation out of nothing, creation anew. It is not simply acting upon or ordering a pre-existing subject. An example of this type is the first Hebrew creation myth in the Christian Old Testament. A cosmic egg myth is a variant of that, where all the elements of creation are undifferentiated. They're mixed within an egg, and that serves as an incubator. And when the egg breaks, there's differentiation and increasing complexity. Now, an example of that is the Chinese myth of Panku that I read earlier. Earth diver myths get a little more bizarre. They're not ex nihilo. They involve instead recovering or reordering existing material. For example, a deity might send an animal or a bird down into the primal waters to bring up a bit of mud from which the earth is made. An example of this is the myth of the Huron Indians of Ontario. World parent myths generally involve two deities closely joined in a primitive state that become broken apart, and that begins the creative and more complex process. An example of this type is the Mesopotamian myth of Apsu and Tiamat in the Enuma Elish. The dismembered god myth. There are elements of destroyed deities that are used specifically to create various parts of the physical world. And an example of this is the latter part of the Apsu and Tiamat Enuma Elish myth, where their bodies make up the visible things seen in the physical world. And finally, there's a thing called the emergence myth. This is different. The world has been previously created. The process is picked up midstream. Sun and sometimes the gods are already there, but it is the creatures themselves that have to change. That is, they mainly have to become human. An example of this is the Navajo myth of the air spirit people who live deep within the earth and undergo an elevating journey through several worlds that ultimately results in becoming human. Since this is a very different myth from those generally espoused in Western civilization, that is those seen in the Hebrew Bible and Christian Old Testament, I'm going to spend a little time here detailing those beliefs before I conclude. As I tell this story, though, try to think about the position of the Navajo, their thoughts and their aspirations, including what they expect of their religion. And with this mindset, this somewhat bizarre and otherworldly story becomes more meaningful. So open up your minds here to a very different religious and cultural perspective. This Navajo myth begins in a lower level of the world. It's populated by the air spirit people who have insect like characteristics. And they lived together in a crowded and tumultuous state characterized by quarreling and adultery. Finally, a ruling chief demands that they leave, but the chief had to resort to flooding to compel them to do so. They were saved only by a blue creature thrusting its head from the sky and showing them a way to a second and higher world, a blue world of the swallow people. And on reaching this new world, the insect people sent out couriers in all 4 directions to explore the land. And what they found was not promising. There were very little vegetation, no beings like themselves. It was a very barren land indeed. Nevertheless, they proposed that the 2 peoples live together in peace and harmony, to which the swallow people agreed. And this lasted for 23 days. But on the 24th day, one of the insect people committed adultery with the wife of the swallow chief. This was not a good move. And once again, the insect people were expelled from a land, and they had to soar upwards towards the sky, seeking escape. However, the sky was hard and not inviting, and they were saved only when a white face appeared through the sky, the face of the wind. He gave them instructions for finding a hole in the sky to the south, through which they emerged into yet a 3rd higher world. And that world was yellow, populated by the grasshopper people. Again, the insect people found the land to be very barren, but they still petitioned the grasshopper people to live together as a united people. And that again worked for 23 days, but on the 24th, one of the insect people violated the wife of the chief of the grasshoppers. Condemnation by the chief was immediate and stinging. For such crimes, I suppose you were chased from the world below. You shall drink no more of our water. You shall breathe no more of our air. Be gone. So the insect people once more flew up to the sky. And once more, it was difficult to penetrate. And finally, a red head stuck out of the sky and told them to fly west. This was the head of Red Wind. And eventually they found an opening in the west, and they flew up in circles until they came to a 4th world. And interestingly, 4 of the grasshoppers came with them. 1 white, 1 blue, 1 yellow, and 1 black. And this is interesting because it was the Navajo explanation for the different colors of grasshoppers that they saw in their own physical world. Well, that 4th world was at first mixed black and white, but eventually was predominantly blue and black. And these changes in colors, including some yellow, differed from the previous worlds. This land was more complicated and larger, and when they sent out couriers in all directions, they couldn't find the end. The most important part seemed to lie to the north, where the insect people found a race of strange men who lived in houses in the ground and cultivated fields. These were the Kasani, or the Pueblos. The Kasani befriended them. They shared their water and their crops, and the insect people resolved to this time behave themselves. Eventually, they were approached by mysterious beings from the east: white body, blue body, yellow body, and black body. And each of those represents a modern Navajo deity. The goal of the gods was to make more people, but in a form like themselves. And those insect people had some shared characteristics, but they had the claws of beasts and insects rather than hands and feet. They were also very unclean. So they were instructed to cleanse themselves until the return of the gods in 12 days. And there's a description of what happened then. Blue body and black body returned, carrying sacred buckskins, and white body carried 2 ears of corn, 1 yellow and 1 white. It reads this way: the gods laid 1 buckskin on the ground with the head to the west. On this they placed the 2 ears of corn with their tips to the east, and over the corn they spread the other buckskin with its head to the east. Under the white ear they put a feather of a white eagle. Under the yellow ear, the feather of a yellow eagle. They then told the people to stand at a distance and allow the wind to enter. The white wind blew from the east, and the yellow wind blew from the west, between the skins. And while the wind was blowing, 8 of the mirage people came and walked around the objects on the ground 4 times. And as they walked, the eagle feathers, whose tips protruded from between the buckskins, were seen to move. When the Mirage people had finished their walk, the upper buckskin was lifted. Ears of corn had disappeared. A man and a woman lay there in their stead. The white ear of corn had been changed into a man, and the yellow ear into a woman. It was the wind that gave them life. This was an important point for the Navajo. It is our breathing, our wind, that continues to give us life. This first man and woman would then procreate and inhabit the world. Now, in this emergence myth, man and women are created out of corn. They don't go through this non-reversible evolutionary process. But the uncertainty of all these worlds, including their different colors and their directions, indicates that the process of metamorphosis can go either way. Interestingly, this use of color and direction is important in the modern recreation of this myth in sand paintings, such as are seen in the American Southwest. And finally, the values of this myth focus on harmony and self-discipline. The homologies of the story are with birth, moving from incompleteness to completeness in the journey from the underground womb to light, which appears in the fourth level. So in summary, what can we say finally about the importance of myth in religion? Even after several hundred years of focusing on rationality and enlightenment, it's not apparent that the value of a very strict code of pure knowledge and pure logic serves either religion or science or society in general very well. But imagination and myth do serve the human spirit. We will never know everything and never be able to view our world and our actions in it on a purely rational basis. What myths say about who is doing the creating or ordering varies significantly, ranging from very abstract depictions of what could be considered divinity to a picturing of human-like individuals that interact directly with the world and the formation of human life. Early humanity relied on supernatural explanations to understand their world, and this led to religious connotations of those myths. But it should be appreciated that mythology, and particularly creation mythology, had a life of its own, and it preceded most major religious developments. It has been said with regard to both mythology and later philosophy that they represent a questioning power of the human mind. Religion is only secondary. It relates to how one acts upon that questioning. Creation myths, especially when they are contained within a religious tradition, tend to reflect a culture, particularly its values, psychology, and societal structure. Myths help to explain why and how those societies organize themselves politically. We also learn something about the literary ability of these peoples. Clearly, we can see this in the Hebrew and Christian accounts, but also in the Navajo account as well. And finally, some have said that these myths represent cultural and universal human dreams. Amen. Please join now in our closing hymn, Forward Through the Ages.
Forward through the ages in unbroken line, move the faithful spirits at the call divine. Gifts in differing measure, hearts of one accord, manifold the service, one the sure reward. Forward through the ages in unbroken line, move the faithful spirit at the call divine. Wider grow must labor till our faith is sight. Prophets have proclaimed it, martyrs testified, poets sung its glory, heroes for it died. Forward through the ages in unbroken line, move the faithful spirit at the call divine. Not alone we conquer, not alone we fall. In each loss or triumph, lose or triumph fall. Bound by God's far purpose in one living whole, move we on together to the shining goal. Forward through the ages in unbroken line, move the faithful spirits at the call divine.
For our benediction, I offer you the words of the Reverend Tom Schade, a retired Unitarian minister who served for years at the First Unitarian Church of Worcester, Massachusetts. My friends, there is a power at work in the universe. It works through human hands, but it was not made by human hands. It is a creative, sustaining, and transforming power, and we can trust that power with our lives and with our ministries. It will sustain us whenever we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we take a stand for peace and justice, whenever we take a risk. Trust in that power. We are together held by that power. Amen and blessed be.
Thank you, Mike, for a wonderful service. Summer is one of my favorite times because we get to hear from the wisdom that's in our own congregants. Thank you so much.